I think we'll go ahead and get going. Again, this is Andy Moffitt, Director of Pre-Construction Services. This morning we're going to look at some cost planning best practices, and John Milani will also be doing some of the training session with me as well. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. If you have any questions, everybody is on mute just to minimize background noise, but you can use the chat function within the WebEx if you have any questions or if you have any issues. The presenter is labeled Mike Ernst, but that's me, Andy, so feel free just to send a chat message if you have any questions or have any issues with the WebEx along the way. So this morning's session, like I said, is a cost planning best practices. I'll say from the beginning, this is the first time we've put all this material into one training session. So a little bit of an experiment with regards to timing. We will be done at 11:30, so we'll keep it to an hour. But I think we probably have more material than we have to fit into an hour. And so what we may do is that we've scheduled 2 of these training sessions, like all the training sessions, and it may become more of a part 1 and 2 if we can't get it fit into one. So I think there's some good material we've put together, but it's covering a pretty broad scope, so there's a lot to fit in. To that point too, it's also been developed more as a presentation you can come back to. So I'll apologize ahead of time. It's not an eye-popping presentation with lots of pictures and lots of fun stuff, I guess, to say it that way, but more something you can come back to later for some process information. So some pictures, some graphics, but also relatively engineering-ish, to say it that way, in order just to cover the topics. I think so. Essentially, how we're going to break this apart is I'll take the first half and just walk through the cost planning best practices for cost modeling and some of the early conceptual pricing, and then John will walk through the SD and DD phase and some things to think about. Like I said, we may not get quite through it all, but we'll stop, or if people need to drop off, we can do that. I know everybody's got a lot going on these days. Again, everybody's on mute, so if you have any questions, just send a chat, and then at the end we'll also have some time for questions. So having said that, we'll dive into it. One more comment is that we are recording these sessions, so if you have to leave early or you can't make it all, it'll be available later on for you to come back to if you wish. And the PowerPoint will also be made available so that you can come back and reference it. So maybe just to go ahead and dive into it and get my PowerPoint going. So what we want to talk about really two steps. And so if you can see the PowerPoint, what this graphic is representing is the overall cost development stages and the life cycle of cost information. From the early onset of your budgeting of a project lifestyle, you have the cost model or the budget comps. We'll talk about that a little bit today. As you move through the design phases and into construction, there are different stages of your estimate and your pricing development. And what we're going to focus on today are these first 3. And really, if we're to put it into 2 sections, it'll be this conceptual and cost model stage and the SD and DD stage. Down further, and we've had some training on these other sessions already, we have the bid forms and the final estimate and the archive process and where all that information goes. We've also talked about some of the cost history along with the archive training in terms of what's available to you in cost history. And our next and probably last training session will be around Modelogics, which will be our new cost history tool. So we'll be rolling out some training on that in the coming months as well. So a couple of things maybe just to talk about some terminology. A lot of people have different terms for different stages or different items. And so there's always a degree of variability, and I don't think we're necessarily trying to say it's got to be the same everywhere, but just internally at Ryan anyway, these are how some things are generally referred to. And we'll show some examples of each of these here in just a minute. But a budget comp, what a budget comp is something that is essentially just a perspective of our project cost history. So typically when you're using a budget comp, it's, or budget comparison, budget comp would be the short term. It is nothing more than a set of similar projects arranged side by side so you can see the cost for those particular projects. When you go to a cost model is essentially the next step of the budget comp. So you have all your historical project costs. Well, now you want to customize those historical costs for a new project or a project that a particular client may be interested in, and so you're molding that budget comp or that historical comp information into a new estimate or new cost model that closer represents the project that you're discussing. So cost model is essentially a customized or molded estimate based on that budget comp information. And then the SD and DD estimate, essentially these are scope-defined estimates, more detailed estimates, line items, unit prices, broken down scope. And so we'll look at all of these as we move along. So first of all, just a quick example and screenshot of a budget comp. I think, again, if you've been around Ryan for a while, you're pretty used to seeing this. One of the things that I'll talk about a little bit is with our cost structure, the difference of uniformat and master format cost arrangement and why we've moved to the uniformat. But this is in the master format, so you can see over here on the left we have our site work, building shell, finishes, systems, indirect costs, and then we have these three projects arranged vertically and what these historical costs are. So there's no suggestion of what a new office tower will be. It's essentially saying here are the three historical perspectives, and obviously you can draw some conclusions based on those projects that are presented. So this would be the typical CSI or master format arrangement of a budget comp. Similarly, this is a similar setup. Again, just a budget comp. There's no suggestion or no cost modeling of a future project, but this is arranged in a systems format, and so very, very similar intent, but just a different way of looking at some of the information. Now, both of these two that I'm showing, a budget comp and both the CSI and the uniformat formats, are available for pretty much any of our projects for the last several years, and these are all coming out of our Excel-based system. And so any project that's been archived or has a final estimate, we can capture this cost information on. The last one here is just a screenshot, and you can start to see some of the similarities, and I apologize for the small size, but I wasn't intending on going into the detail, but this is more or less the same thing, just coming out of Modelogics, which will be our, like I said, our new resource for being able to pull out our historical costs. And same concept, but slightly different. Your historical projects are lined up here vertically. There's a number of different ways you can view them, and then you have the opportunity to create a customized model within that. So again, basic premise, basic idea is that we're capturing our project estimates and we're bringing them forward, trying to capture enough information to make them usable and relevant, and bringing them forward, escalating them, putting location factors, all those kind of things, so that we can be more accurate in our cost planning and projections. So along those lines, I think what it's worth pointing out is part of that move in the cost model stage is to look at things from a systems basis, rather uniformat, which is the industry standard, rather than the CSI and master format. And this is really the backbone of why our template is set up like it is and why we're trying to capture cost information the way that we are. because inherently, we talked about this with the archive training if you sat through that, but inherently the way that we manage cost budgets from a contract perspective through construction is not a very good way to manage cost planning and forecasting in looking at building costs from an early stage. And so we're left living in two systems. One is the systems and uniformat basis for cost planning. The other is the master format or cost code or contract basis for managing construction projects. And I'll illustrate this here, and you can, I think, pretty quickly get a sense of why that is. And from a historical cost or cost planning purposes, this is your typical CSI breakout that we have showing up on the screen. And there's no connection between the cost and the unit of measurement. So for instance, a couple of the items that are circled here, this on roofing, what the report would tell us is that it's a $400,000 total, and it's $2 per gross square foot. Now, what you don't know about this project is this a, you can do the math and say that's a 200,000 square foot building, but is it 2 floors? Is it 4 floors? Is it 1 floor? It's $2 a gross square foot for roofing. Is that always a good number? Take our building square footage and multiply it by $2 a square foot and escalate it, and is that a number you can rely on? Similar thing with glass and glazing. There's no relationship between the $318 a square foot and the $629,000 that's being shown for the glass and glazing. So there's a disconnect between the items that you have from a historical perspective, the divisions of cost. There's a disconnect between what the dollars are and what the reporting unit price is. Now, some things stay pretty consistent. Mechanical, electrical, you typically look at those as a cost per square foot all the time. So that's not necessarily true for every division or every section. But much of the other sections of our costs can be related differently or at least more relevantly than just the cost per gross square foot. To illustrate this with our system setup, and this gets back to, if I back up a couple slides, it's the difference between this comparison report here and this comparison report here. And so you're looking at costs over the relevant system quantity. So floor construction, for instance, in this particular building that's being as the example here, it's a 200,000 square foot facility, 2 floors, 1 floor each of 99,000 square feet. So essentially, just for round numbers, let's say you've got 2 floors of 100,000 feet. And what you're seeing here is that the system, which is the floor construction, which is steel, concrete, metal deck, everything that's involved in that structural system, is being allocated over that system quantity. So now you have a relevant benchmark that $18 a square foot is the cost of that system. $14 a square foot is the cost of the roof system. Similarly, to go back to our roofing example that I mentioned earlier, you have a cost per gross square foot, which is what this column right here is. It shows that it's $2.14, but when you look at the system cost, which is the roof dollars over the roof area, you see that it's $4.27. So at a macro level, or at a cost planning or historical cost level, these system costs become something that's relevant and transferable. So as you sit down and do a cost model, rather than just looking at roofing as a cost per gross square foot, roofing should be modeled over the roof area. Same thing with skin. You can see the disconnects or the differences between these costs as a gross square footage and these costs as a system cost. So the exterior skin at the level 2 is looked at over the entire skin area. So in this case, it's a $35 square foot skin over 73,000 feet. And there's some breakdowns of the hard surface area and the glazing area and some of those components at a level 3. So you can make the connection that from a cost planning perspective, and as we track our estimates and we track our projects, these costs here all start to fall into ranges. What I would tell you in looking at several of these over time is that for an office building such as this, your range for your floor construction is going to be 16 to 19. Your roof is probably 12 to 15, and that's your typical range for that system cost. Skin, as you can imagine, can vary quite a bit based on the quality and the fenestration and the materials used and the amount of materials. But $35 over the skin area would be a signal to me that that's a pretty efficient skin. Sometimes you can see that up to $65, $75, even $85 a square foot over the skin area. But as you start to think and talk in those kind of terms, you can understand the building and start to drive to certain price points. So if a client, for instance, wants to spend $120 a square foot all in, well, you can very quickly, by using this approach, dial in what does that 120,000 square foot building need to be? How much floor construction? How much roof construction? How much skin? How much roofing? And you can model those historical system prices over the quantities of that building. So that's maybe a couple points. Or one, making the connection between system pricing and the system quantities. Two, if we're recording our projects in this manner, which is inherently not the same as our CSI or master format, we have much more intelligent or much more relevant information. And the third one is that it's something that you can move going forward. You can use going forward. Excuse me. So what I want to go into next then is just some of the steps to think about in developing a cost model. And maybe one more point before I do this, and this is just kind of a plug for our archive process. And again, some of this may be starting to sound a little bit repetitive if you've gone through these training sessions, so I would apologize for that. But it is important as we're doing our cost archives that we're breaking the information down into these levels. And some of that takes a little more effort than others. So for instance, in steel construction, you'll see that steel is broken out between floor and roof construction. You might have subcontractors wonder why that is, but as you can inherently understand, there's a difference in those two systems, and so we're trying to capture that cost breakout differently. Same thing on the skin. The skin system inherently includes a portion of Division 9 drywall, which would be your exterior studs, your exterior sheathing, whatever that is. And you want to capture that as part of your exterior skin system, not part of your interiors. The tendency may be to drop those costs into your interiors, but we're trying to keep those separated so we can gain better understanding of what that skin system is as a whole. So again, not to repeat some of those concepts, but hopefully you can kind of understand where some of this is starting to go. So real quick, I'm going to start going into some of the things to think about when you go into the cost model or budget comp stage. And we'll look at 5 steps to creating a cost model. Number 1, identify comparable projects. And number 2 would be to establish the building parameters, and this would be for the new building or the project you're creating a cost model for. Establish the building scope by systems. The operating point there is to go to kind of that mid-level, the detail, and that'll be probably a term I use a couple times. You're not trying to figure out all the widgets, but you're trying to understand the basics of the scope. Mechanical systems is an easy one to talk about. You're not trying to understand how many zones you'll have, but you do want to know, are you thinking about a geothermal system or are you thinking about a packaged rooftop system? So that's what it means to establish scope by systems. Define inclusions and exclusions. The shell, the TI, where's the dividing line between shell and TI? Is it a cold dark shell, one lit shell, whatever that definition might be. Design costs, owner scope, those kind of things. What are the lines of the inclusions, exclusions? Again, the goal is not to get terribly detailed, but at least do enough so that you're trying to minimize surprises in the future. And then the 5th step would be to model each of those systems, based on what you've decided for parameters, scope, inclusions, exclusions, your historical pricing, and establish a system range based on those items. So step number 1 in identifying comparable projects. Point 1 is start with where you're going. It seems pretty basic, But when you sit down to do a cost model, you want to think about what is it that you want to project. What's the square footage? What's the level of quality? What are some of those items that seem pretty basic, but you want to at least have some thought process to what you're presenting that this cost model would represent, and try to keep it more than just purely a shot in the dark. Another point in terms of just thinking of benchmark and finding similar projects is remember that you can mix and match systems to a point. The example there is that you may have a medical office building that you could compare to an office building, and the shell cost in a lot of ways would be pretty similar. Brick, glass, precast, metal panel, whatever it is. You could compare shell building to shell building, but you have to obviously recognize that your interiors or your MEPs will be very different between those two types of construction. So you can cross-pollinate systems between buildings, and you can use other types of buildings for your benchmarks, but at times it'll just be components and not the whole system, or not the whole building, excuse me. Next thing to think about would be the importance of the relevancy. And what I mean by relevancy is the projects that you're selecting for your budget comp, how are they related to the new budget that you're creating with your cost model? And think about scope, size, time, and location. So it's always a good idea to go into and look at some of those previous projects. If we're doing our archives correctly, this really isn't that hard. The estimates that we're creating when we archive that final estimate should tell the story of the project. If we're not using lump sums or just lumping everything into big numbers, you get a sense of, okay, what was the skin on this building? What was the interior? What were the interiors like? Mechanical systems, electrical systems. Again, you don't have to have a million lines of detail, but with just some major breakouts and a couple clues along the way that we leave in the archive process, you can pretty quickly get back into some of our old estimates and understand what was going on with the project. We're also archiving in a lot of cases scope documents or some floor plans and site plans. When we move into Modelogics, these things will all be available with the archive. So in just a few minutes, you can get a decent sense of what the project you're comparing to is like. So it's related to scope. If you're comparing office buildings, you may want to equalize for the fact that one building may have had constant volume rooftop units for the mechanical system. Another one may have geothermal. Another one may have VRF. You just want to be balancing out those in terms of looking at the relevancy of your comparable projects. And if you find one project that most closely represents the project you're creating, you will probably weigh more heavily on that project as it relates to being the most relevant in terms of scope and size. Size, again, it's best practice to stay within the similar scale, if at all possible. As you know, the economies of scale can play into it. They're kind of break points. My observation, there's no science to this, but my observation is anything under 20,000 feet tends to carry pretty high dollar per unit just because of the small quantity. When you get in that range of 30 to 60, they start to be pretty consistent. And then when you start hitting 100 and 200 and 300,000 square foot buildings, you start getting even more economies of scale. But just a point to remember, scale up, you're all right. Scale down, you're in for a fight. And the point there to remember is that, if you were to say take a 40,000 square foot office building and convert it to a 30,000 square feet, well, you probably have two elevators either way. You're still going to have some site costs either way. Your skin reduction is not straight line. So even though you've taken out 25% of your square footage, you're not taking out 25% of your skin. You're not taking out 25% of your mechanical costs. So just realize that there's a scaling difference as you go up and down in the square footage. For the most part, you can scale up, but you could run the risk of having too much cost if you scale up a small building to a large one that had higher unit prices. Then obviously you'd overinflate your larger one. So just be aware of that dynamic. And again, sometimes it can be hard to pinpoint to a science, but it's just something you have to be aware of, and that's the art part of it. Escalation and location. These are both tricky. We all know they exist, but it can be difficult to pin them down with an exact science again. Escalation, everybody knows, or everybody should be decently aware that we use ENR, the ENR matrix, or the index as our escalation forecast. And so as ENR tracks monthly a bucket of materials and labor and those costs, they create a percentage that we use and we spread across all our projects. The thing to recognize in all of our templates and tools that are available that deal with escalation is it takes the macro percentage and spreads it across. So we all know that sometimes steel will go up faster than drywall, or lumber will go up, and that different materials may escalate at different rates. But just understand that when you apply that percentage, it's applying it across everything. So again, difficult to get the science down to a T, but we know those things exist, and so we're dealing with them best we can. Location is another one. We use the RS means location index for that. It's not perfect either, but it's kind of an industry standard available index that helps. So in the new system, which we'll train on later with Monologics, it allows you to easily make those adjustments for escalation and location. Next point there, in terms of just establishing comparable projects, understand the unique aspects of an archive project. Did the project you're comparing to, did it have a generator and UPS backup, or was there no backup? Some of those kind of things can add swings of several dollars a square foot, and so you just want to be aware of them as you're using those for comparables. And last point is talk to the project superintendents and PMs. That's probably the best takeaway from this. When you're looking at historical projects, give them a call. As part of our archive, the names of the PMs and SUPs are stored as part of the estimate. Pull them up, look at them, give them a call, ask them the ins and outs of it, and there's no replacement for that. So you got to be willing to pick up the phone and call them. The next part, in terms of identifying comparables, and I won't read all these. We'll just kind of fly through these. Like I said, this PowerPoint will be available for you to come back to later. But more thoughts in terms of understanding what you're comparing to. And granted, depending on the time that you have or the situation you're faced with, you may not have time to look through all of these, but these are just things you should be thinking about. What was the archive that you're looking at? Were these buyout costs? Was it the final cost? Was it a pursuit estimate? What's the level of quality of information that you're comparing it to? What was the deal structure? Was it development, third-party, design build, design assist? These things all have implications in the indirect cost, largely, but they're good to understand when you're looking at a cost model. Design costs, were they included in the old one? Do you need to include them in your new one? What was the rate fee? Unique general conditions. Those items directly affect our risk even more, and so those things are good to understand when you're making those comparisons. Review the quality of the archive. Back to my earlier point in terms of how we're trying to break out costs so that the information presented is relevant. If you're getting an archive where all of drywall, for instance, was lumped into the interior partitions, well, you'll have a skewed perspective on what that exterior envelope costs because it'll be missing a portion of the system. Similarly, on concrete, if concrete is just put in one spot under foundations, and your slab on deck and your site concrete and all that is just entered as a one lump sum in one section of the estimate, well, the information presented as you look at that will essentially be of no value because your systems will be misrepresented, and so you've lost any intelligence created within that archive. So look at the quality of the archive and just get a general sense of is what's in here reliable or not. Now, for the most part, what we're trying to do as part of this initiative is keep that information relatively clean, but obviously we're reliant on all of us as we create the estimates to try to keep the information clean and as we archive them. So we're trying to keep that stuff clean, but once in a while something slips through, so it's always good to go back and make sure you're looking at information that's relevant. Item 2, establish the parameters. The parameters are basically the macro quantities of the building: gross square foot, skin area, roof area, elevated structure area, site area, all those level 1 through 3 quantities of a building. A solid cost model will have at least some level 3. And so what that means, if I go back up to our example here too, level 1 would be the shell total. Level 2 would be the green lines here. So in this case, it would be the enclosure subtotal. And then level 3 would be the further breakdown of the systems. So when it says that a good cost model will have at least some level 3 breakdowns, a good example would be this superstructure. You could go in and put in $16 a square foot over your total area, but you're probably a little better in going in and at least breaking it down between what's my roof area and my floor area, because those are two different systems. So that's what it means to say that, typically you'll have at least some level 3 breakout. If you don't know in terms of the shape of the building or the size of the building, make something up. If you have a 200,000 square foot building, give it a length and a width and maybe some ins and outs and a couple offsets or something like that. You can talk through that with your design team, but create a scenario that represents those macro quantities. It's not hard to do. And the last point there in terms of establishing the parameters is just a general comment that you should get used to filling out those parameters on each estimate, because regardless of which stage you're in, they're valuable for analyzing or just understanding things from a macro perspective. So from the first estimate to the last estimate, just get used to thinking in terms of ground floor area, elevated structure area, skin area, roof area, all those things that are listed on that parameters page. And then third point would be to establish the baseline scope. Define the systems with the design team. Foundations, or you think you're going to be talking deep foundations or spread footings or geo-piers, or skin, are we talking precast or lots of glass or metal panels or brick or some fancy new material? Mechanical, electrical, do we have generator backup? Do we have, like I said earlier, geothermal systems or something like that? Again, doesn't mean you have to go to a lot of detail, but at least define your target. And at least generally assume what kind of foundation system, what kind of skin, what kind of structure, all those items. Have some target that you're thinking about when you put in these price points. The second point there in terms of establishing the baseline scope, the level of commitment or risk that you're taking on when you present this pricing should dictate the level of detail in the analysis. So for instance, if you have a day and a client's asking for a hard number, you should be pretty careful about what the scope is and defining that scope and defining it in that detail and creating the right qualifications for presenting that information. So it totally depends on the context of how it's being brought to you, and you'll want to take on different, like I said, a different level of information detail analysis based on what your level of commitment is with the deliverable that you're creating. Sometimes you may need to go to level 4, general requirements, indirect costs. Skin can be one of those big drivers that a client likes to think about early on, so that may be one you'd want to go a little bit deeper on. But again, that's a judgment call based on the time and the place of the deliverable. So just a quick example here in terms of what those parameters are and those system costs. So as you can imagine, here's an example of an MOB, and this is a pretty efficient building in terms of shape. The most efficient building obviously is a square. A square building gives you the most square footage for the least amount of skin. And if you look at much cost information or structured cost information, what you'll see is that site, MEP, and skin are often one of your major drivers. And so a square building is the most efficient. The longer and skinnier you get, the more skin you have for the square footage. Most people don't, and most architects don't like designing pure squares, so they're usually at least some sort of rectangle, and then on up from there. But those system parameters, so in this case the skin is 17,000 square feet, and it includes this mix of materials. You can kind of understand, you could put $1 per square foot for this system just based on that number, or you could even break this down to some percentages. And what you would be thinking about is we have so much brick, well, it has a backup wall that needs to be included. EFIS, it has a backup wall that needs to be included, curtain wall and storefront. You could break those out individually, or you could say, hey, this is going to be a $35 skin, all in over 17,000 square feet. You can start to notice the relationship between the skin area and this gross square footage. On smaller buildings, you'll usually have a higher aspect ratio, which is how much skin you have per square footage. The larger you get, you get more efficient in terms of you have more square footage for the amount of skin. But then the shape of the building, the number of floors, all those things play into that same dynamic. Again, the less skin you have for the square footage, the more efficient, and therefore the less cost you have. Ground floor area, elevated structure, roof structure, these things all have system costs. Ground floor area for this kind of building, you're probably in the $10 to $14 a square foot range for footings, foundations, and slab and structural X. Elevated structure, you're probably in the 14 to 18 range, maybe 15 to 18. Roof structure, 12 to 15. So those things all start to hit ranges. And so you can see that pretty quickly you can mold and shape this building to come up to what you think it should cost based on those system quantities. And this is just a part of the template. I think everybody's used to seeing this, that you can grab your parameters, ground area, upper floor area, finished area, roof surface. All of these things drive these system quantities that we're talking about. So that's one of the importance for just making sure you're getting used to filling these out every estimate you do. It will just help you think about structured cost information as you move through the project. As a quick example, just while we're on the skin topic, I have two buildings here that are created with these massing models that are essentially the same square footage. So it's not uncommon that a client or an architect or whoever's involved in your team may look at these and say, well, how do I know if there's any cost difference between these two buildings? And you would intuitively look at one and you probably think, okay, there's a curve, that's got to be more expensive. But how would you go about making that comparison? And what you can see here is by using this systems approach, you can pretty quickly say, and this is some dated pricing, so don't mind the unit price numbers as much, but looking at the roof area, the skin area, the structure of both of those, the elevated floors, the slab on grade, slab on deck, and some of those system components, and just looking at the different quantities based on those massing models, you can come to some determination from an early perspective in terms of which scenario may have a premium on it based purely on the massing models. Keeping all the scope equal, it's purely just based on the massing. So thinking in these kind of terms lets you make those kind of judgment calls. And frankly, when you do it that way, you never have to back up. You get it right, and you can make those informed decisions early in the process, and you can control your budget much better. So number 4, steps in defining a cost model. Define the ins and outs. Again, the goal here isn't to go to every nut and bolt and screw, but look at the big picture item and the things that could cause surprises later. And a couple of tools that we have to facilitate that is the scope matrix. We've done some training on that in the past, but it's essentially saying it's a matrix that goes through and says, okay, are we doing cabling or is that by the owner? Are we doing AV or is that by the owner? Are we providing benches and trash receptacles and those kind of things, or is that by the owner? Some of those things can be smaller, but they can also be surprises down the road if we haven't talked about them. And they're pretty easy to talk about early and just say, hey, do we need to include this in our budget, or do you have a budget for this? And it just prevents people from being surprised down the road. Same thing with a scope document. At this level, again, you don't want to get into too much detail, but define the big items. Shell and TI matrix, where is the line between shell and TI? And you can use that to define for your cost model how much is being included in your shell and how much is in the TI. Development costs, owner costs, design costs, etc. All these things should be looked at and understood that whether or not you should be including them in your cost model. Last one, be create the model. So system cost for system quantity, we've talked through that. Establishing the system costs Utilize the benchmark. What's the current market saying? What's the project? What do you know about it? And if some of these things you don't know, you may need to dig a little bit deeper to come to some of those conclusions. When you start thinking in terms of systems, make sure you capture all the scope. And what that means is sometimes it's easy if you think about a foundation system. If you just think about from a historical perspective, the line item may say that you're $14 a square foot for your foundations, and that would include slab on grade, excavation, footings, vapor barrier, stoops. All those kind of things are rolled into that foundation number. And if you do if you use a lower number than what your typical system cost includes, just know that it may be missing some scope unless you're capturing all the scope that's included in that system. So similar point in that next bullet point, to think about them all in. The exterior wall includes the gyp, the framing, insulation, exterior materials. Those things are all part of that system. Okay, one last comment, and I can see that as I mentioned earlier on, this is the first time we've done this whole session, so we're probably not going to be able to get through all of it in 1 hour. And so I think what we'll do is we'll just make a game time call here to say, well, at this first session, we'll just get through the cost model piece, and then on the next one, we'll focus on the SD and DD estimate. That way we can be respectful of everybody's time. So we'll go ahead, and we've got 15 minutes left here. We'll finish up the cost modeling, and then we'll save the rest of it for the next time. One thing I did want to cover was just what I'll call the one-offs, and this can be this question from an owner that doesn't fit by definition, typical cost or typical projects. And what it might be, and I'll just show an example. This is a recent example from the Cargill project that the North Central Hub is working on. If you're not familiar, the North Central Hub is doing a fairly significant renovation for Cargill, their corporate headquarters. But the question to them was, we'd like to add some conference rooms within an existing atrium. Well, you might be tempted to say, okay, well, it's just a conference room, it's finishes, whatever, maybe it's $100 a foot if I'm conservative. Well, those kind of questions are pretty difficult to throw a unit cost, a historical unit cost at conference room should cost X, because there's just a lot of different things happening within this project. You've got new structure, you've got foundations, you're in an environment that's already closed, how do you get things into the building, all those kind of things. It's a little more difficult just to answer that. And in reality, the best way to solve that kind of question really is just to break it down, and you got to break it down into some manageable chunks. And so there's a couple things to think about, and the end result of this one, and I'll just show a quick example, was just starting to go through and build the scope in your mind as you look at it, this one-off, and you essentially just have to step through all the parts and pieces. There's really no shortcut. There's no other way around it if you want to have at least some degree of confidence in what you're putting together than just to step through it. So here are a couple things to think about. One, break the scope down into manageable chunks. And the second point really plays into that. Build the scope like you're going to build the project. And what I would typically recommend is that you just start from day one. You're showing up on the job. What are you going to do? You got to create access into the building. You got some demo to do within it. You got some structure to build within this new conference floor. You've got to figure out how to get your concrete in. And you got to figure out how to get your steel in, and how much steel do you need, and just thinking through that process of how you're going to build it. And then your budget should more or less just reflect that. And as you work your way through it, some of the pricing can be a little bit of a guesswork, and you may need to involve some subcontractors or your hub pre-construction manager. But that's really the best way, just to go through and identify the cost of those one-offs. In some sense, there's not a lot of shortcuts. There's typically lots of parts and pieces to that kind of thinking, and you shouldn't necessarily count on subs to understand the scope, but it's probably a good idea to solicit and listen to their feedback, but you also just need to make sure you understand the scope yourself. I said this earlier, by definition, one-offs don't lend themselves to historical comparisons. They're usually pretty unique, and so sometimes it can be hard to find anything that's relevant. Now, having said that, you can use the unit cost that we can pull from our projects. Unit cost for materials or carpet, doors, glazing, some of those kind of things can be applicable, at least as benchmarks. So for that particular one, the team there looked at typical cost for a curtain wall, but added a factor to identify the fact that it's within existing construction. You got difficulty getting materials in, but it used the historicals as a benchmark, but then made adjustments based on the particular conditions of that project. Last comment, easy to miss stuff. So most of the times when we're doing these one-offs, you're not in a competitive scenario. It's typically better to be a little bit conservative because there's a lot you can't see and a lot you don't know at that point. But again, there's really no shortcut for just sitting down and breaking down the scope and walking through it. So just some things to think about when you get in that kind of scenario. Just as a note or reference point, when you get into projects that have a lot of this, they can be some of your more complicated cost planning events. It takes more time. It's more time to sit through it. You have to understand the scope. The pricing is 100% just based on the scope. You got to understand the scope. So just know that you're in for some more time and more effort, and especially the more of these that you have.
Andy,
Yeah.
This is John. I got a quick question for you on that last cost breakdown for the cargo project. Why wasn't the estimate template used in that occasion?
Great question, John. And what I would say is a typical reference point, it probably is better to stick to the template. And in this particular case, it was just for efficiency, and they weren't sure where the scope was going, and the project manager, and I helped out as well, was really just to think through the scope. So it's a great question. I think the standing recommendation would be that you should be using the estimate template because it has all these line items in there. But at the time, we made the decision not to. So at the same time, I'd say one of the major goals in this and providing the templates is to make it efficient, but you shouldn't necessarily feel limited to that. I think the next step of this would be at the next stage to get this into the template. So this is really just merely a stopgap for a quick hitter. But that's a good question, John. Any other questions? Okay. Well, last thing, maybe just to touch on this, I think this is the last thing, yes. Just the deliverables. And this will vary from office to office and hub to hub, but just a couple things to think about. What you might be presenting. It could be a level 2 cost model. It could be the cost summary. These are tabs or predefined, if I could say it that way, in the template. So to John's comment about that one particular case about not using the template, if you use the template, you'll have immediate access to some of the summary and presentation pages. So that's always a good idea. But one thing to comment on is just in presenting cost information, and later on in the PowerPoint, there's some slides that indicate this. Keep in mind a couple things. One is most of the time, clients are going to start with the bottom number. So you might as well go there first and start there to set the context. The other thing is when you're presenting cost information, think in terms of here's where we were, or here's the client's expectation, here's what's changed, and here's where we are. And the goal is that you're presenting information, not purely data, and your deliverables should reflect that. Outline specification, matrices, any of those kind of things that help clarify scope. Again, make sure they're relevant, formatted nicely, correctly, consistently, so that you have a professional-looking deliverable. And then a milestone schedule. While we need to do the detailed schedules to make sure we understand the reality and how things work, reading those schedules for a client or even a designer sometimes can be a little bit like reading Greek. And so it's good to transfer that into milestones or some other type of summary document that makes it easily digestible information. Again, those may vary from hub to hub, but, and there are some examples out there if you have some questions on that. But overall goal is to make sure to remember that we're presenting information, not purely data, and to have something that's a professional, well-representing document that represents you as an individual and Ryan as a company. I think, John, I don't know what your thoughts are. I guess I'd say maybe we'll take the second session to cover the SD and DD. I think we kind of thought that might be the case anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
That way we'll keep everybody on schedule. So, like I said, we kind of thought this would probably be too much for one session. So I'll just take a couple minutes just to click through and get to some slides here at the end. We'll come back to some of these other parts. And we'll crank through some tips to remember, and then you can, we'll open up the line for questions and other comments. So I'll fly through these. Tips to remember. Budget management is really scope management. You'll realize that eventually. It's hard to recover from zero. Zahn, 2007. Designers are thinking farther than they're drawing. Talk to them. Subs can be experts. Subs can be amazingly ignorant. Good luck. Involve the people that live at the end, superintendents, property managers, commission agents. Remember, developers will always take something out. Property managers will always add something in. Good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. Designer plus manufacturer equals budget. Bad idea. If you're not over budget at SD, you're not trying hard enough. If you leave SD over budget, you're still not trying hard enough. Get to work. SD is the most critical phase of a project. It should stand for scope definement. Spend the time and energy necessary to figure it out there and sail through the rest. Don't sweat the petty things and don't pet the sweaty things. Don't be afraid to ask others to review your work. We're all in this together. On development deals, know whether or not you're working in gross square foot or rentable square foot. If you don't know what this means, go figure it out today. Once you get to a relatively static scope, you can almost always add square foot and keep the performer right side up. Be careful reducing square footage without knowing what it does to the deal. Manage your shell and TI scope to your advantage. This is an opportunity and a risk. When presenting budgets to clients, remember these things. Start with the total. They're there already anyway. Use this formula. Here's where we were, original or last budget. Here's what changed, scope, accepted alternates, price changes, etc. And here's where we are, current budget. Even though in your mind things may have changed, the client is thinking about the last number you told them. Remember, you're presenting information and not data. Clients aren't always interested in data. Be sensitive to whether or not they want all the detail or just the main points. We think in terms of scope or systems. Clients think in terms of areas. Most often they don't care what concrete costs, but they do want to know what adding 50 parking stalls cost. Keep this in mind when setting up your budget and use breakouts liberally. Use graphs. There are times when it's okay for a client to see the sausage being made, and non-development is the context. They defend what they understand. Sometimes that may be your best strategy, but be smart about when and how. And tips to remember are completed. I'm going to go ahead and open up the line, see if I can do this here. I think I can unmute everybody. And I'm having trouble figuring this out. I'm just going to do this one at a time here. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions or comments or anything that anybody may have to add to it. Okay. There's no questions. I think we'll make this available. Like I said, I know a lot of this is just text on the screen, which isn't great for presentations, but part of the goal is to make this available for something to somebody can come back to later. So we'll post this, and so this will be available. And during session 2, we'll plan on hitting some of the best practices, and John will lead that up with regarding a SD and DD effort. So kind of how we're thinking in these terms is, your first one is that 1 hour, 2 hour, 1 day, 1 week time frame for developing a cost opinion. And then when you get into your SD and DD efforts, those are typically a 2 to 3 week exercise, and they're more time intensive pricing events. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us, and otherwise we'll call it good, and we'll look forward to talking to everybody on session 2. So thanks for your time, and we'll talk to everybody later.